Have you ever wondered what heaven sees when two people who were ready to give up on each other choose to stay? Not out of duty, not out of fear, but because something deeper pulled them back together? And does God really care about the private struggles of an ordinary marriage? The kind of pain that never makes headlines? The kind of fight that happens behind closed doors? Throughout history, the church has taught that marriage is sacred, a covenant before God. But it is also human, fragile, built between two wounded people who bring their failures and their fear into the same room every single day. In 16th century Spain, when Teresa of Avila lived, marriages were arranged for property, for alliance, for survival. Love was considered a bonus, not a requirement. Divorce did not exist in Catholic countries. Annulments were rare and expensive, available only to the wealthy with church connections. Most couples who found themselves trapped in cold or hostile marriages had no exit. They could separate, living in different houses while remaining legally bound, but remarriage was impossible. The options were simple: stay and suffer, or stay and fight for something better. Within this truth, few saints were given the gift to see what heaven actually thinks when a couple chooses love again. Saint Teresa of Avila, the Carmelite reformer from 16th century Spain, is known for her visions of angels, of Christ, of purgatory and hell. Born in 1515 in Avila, a walled city northwest of Madrid, she entered the Carmelite monastery of the Incarnation at age 20 in 1535. For nearly 30 years, she lived the comfortable, lax life common to Spanish convents of that era, where nuns received visitors freely, kept personal possessions, and observed the rule loosely. But in 1556, at age 41, Teresa experienced a profound conversion that changed everything. She began receiving visions, locutions, raptures. She saw Christ wounded, angels with flaming spears, souls in purgatory crying for help. She started the reform that would split the Carmelite order, founding 17 convents across Spain between 1562 and her death in 1582. This vision does not appear in her famous works, not in the interior castle written in 1577, not in the book of her life completed in 1565, not in the way of perfection composed between 1562 and 1566. It sits quietly in a collection most people have never read. Call her Book of Testimonies and Spiritual Relations. This collection, far less known than her major works, contains 65 separate accounts written between 1560 and 1581 at the request of her spiritual directors. The Church required mystics to submit their experiences to examination, to protect against delusion, heresy, or demonic deception. Teresa wrote these relations reluctantly. She found it humiliating to expose her interior life to scrutiny, but obedience demanded it. The specific account we are talking about appears in relation number 8, written in 1571 while she was founding the Carmelite convent in Alba de Tormes, a small town about 50 kilometers southeast of Salamanca. She was 56 years old. She had been experiencing visions for 15 years. She knew how to distinguish a true spiritual experience from imagination or illness. She had been interrogated by Inquisition officials, examined by theologians, praised by some confessors, and condemned by others. She was not naive. She was not prone to fantasy. When she said she saw something, her confessors took it seriously. The interior castle, written in just 2 months in 1577 while she was ill and exhausted, lays out the 7 stages of prayer as 7 rooms in a castle. It is her masterpiece, required reading in seminaries, translated into 40 languages. The Life, her autobiography, written under obedience between 1562 and 1565, tells the story of her conversion, her visions, her struggles with health and with skeptical confessors. But this testimony, buried in a lesser-known work, holds a truth that cuts deep. It was never meant for publication. It was a private report to her confessor, Father Domingo Bañez, a Dominican theologian who defended her against accusations of heresy. He kept the document. After her death, it was copied, archived, and eventually included in the complete editions of her works, published in the 19th and 20th centuries. But she describes them clearly enough. They were believers, regular at Mass, known in their town as decent people. They owned property, probably a small farm or a workshop. They had children, at least 2, maybe more. From the outside, their marriage looked stable. Neighbors saw them at market together, at church together, at local festivals. No scandal, no violence, no public fights. But Teresa had heard from the wife directly, months earlier, that something inside their relationship had collapsed. She had asked God to restore her heart. Nothing changed. The woman said she was beginning to wonder if it was even a sin to stop trying. Teresa understood what she was really asking. Is it wrong to give up when there is nothing left to give? Cold. She told her to keep praying, to keep choosing kindness even when it felt hollow, and to trust that God sees what no one else can see. She reminded her that marriage is a sacrament, which means it carries grace, but grace does not work without cooperation. You must open the door, Teresa had said. Even if you cannot feel him, you must keep asking him to come in. She assumed the advice had been forgotten or ignored. Teresa was used to this, People came to her with deep problems, received her counsel, then disappeared. Some took the advice, some did not. She prayed for them all, but she rarely knew the outcome. She was founding convents, writing, traveling, dealing with opposition from church authorities and from Carmelite friars who hated her reform. She did not have time to follow up on every spiritual conversation. But then, during prayer one quiet evening in 1571, Teresa was lifted suddenly into what she calls an intellectual vision, a state where she saw spiritual realities without physical images, but with a clarity sharper than sight. Not literally standing, Teresa explains, but present in spirit, their souls visible in the way they truly were. Teresa had experienced intellectual visions before. She distinguished them carefully from imaginative visions, where she saw images, and from corporeal visions, where physical manifestations appeared. Intellectual visions, she wrote, carried absolute certainty. You did not see with eyes, you knew with a knowledge that bypassed sight altogether. You understood realities directly, the way angels understand, without images or words. This kind of vision, she insisted, could not be faked or imagined. It came from outside the soul, not from within, not with human passion, but with something Teresa describes as a fire lit by grace. The woman had made a choice, Teresa understood, not to leave, not to settle into silent resentment, but to ask God to change her. And he had answered. Teresa saw the exact moment of the change. It had happened 3 weeks earlier, on a Thursday morning. The woman had been kneeling in the parish church after Mass, alone. She had whispered a prayer she had prayed 100 times before. Lord, I cannot love him. I have nothing left. But this time, she added one more line. If you want me to stay, you will have to give me a new heart. I cannot make one myself. She had stopped pretending she could manufacture love through willpower or duty. She had handed the whole broken thing to God and said, fix this, or I will die inside. And God had moved. Teresa saw grace pouring into the woman's soul like water into a dry riverbed. It did not erase the hurt. It did not rewrite the past. But it gave her the capacity to love again, not with her own strength, but with his. But what struck Teresa even more was what she saw in heaven's response. She writes that she perceived the joy of the angels and saints over this one private act of fidelity. She says the delight in heaven was so intense, so visible, that it felt like a feast had been prepared for this couple alone. No one on earth knew what had happened. No one applauded. The woman's choice had been made in silence, in the ordinary routine of her days. Yet heaven saw it, and heaven celebrated it, as if a great victory had been won. Teresa understood why. Every soul that chooses love over despair, fidelity over abandonment, is a soul that rejects hell. And hell hates nothing more than a marriage it thought it had destroyed being pulled back from the edge. Also, comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the critical edition of Teresa's complete works published by the Instituto de Espiritualidad in Madrid, particularly Volume 1 of the Obras Completas, edited by Efren de la Madre de Dios and Otger Stegink, which includes the full text of her spiritual relations with historical annotations and manuscript comparisons from the Escorial, Valladolid, and Salamanca codices, and from Rowan Williams's scholarly study, Teresa of Avila, Ecstatic Witness, published by Bloomsbury in 2013, which examines her lesser-known visions in their theological and historical context, with direct reference to the spiritual direction manuals of her era. Now back to the information. She understood in that moment that God does not measure greatness the way people do. A marriage saved is not less important to him than a monastery founded. A private choice to stay faithful when no one is watching matters just as much as a public confession before thousands. Heaven does not wait for applause, it waits for truth. Teresa had seen this principle before in other visions, but never so clearly applied to marriage. She had seen souls in purgatory, some of them priests and nuns, suffering not for public sins, but for private coldness, for going through the motions without love. And now she was seeing the opposite, a laywoman, not a religious, not famous, not holy in any visible way, being celebrated in heaven for choosing love in the privacy of her own heart. If the wife had chosen to harden her heart completely, to live the rest of her life in cold indifference, she would not have committed the sin of adultery or divorce, but she would have starved her own soul. Teresa saw that a marriage without love, when love is possible but refused, becomes a kind of slow death. The sacrament remains, but the grace it was meant to carry dries up like a stream that stops flowing. The couple would have stayed together in body, fulfilled their legal and social obligations, raised their children, attended church, died in a state of technical obedience, but their souls would have withered. Teresa saw this clearly. She saw the thin line between patient endurance, which is a virtue, and bitter resignation, which is a poison. It was the wife's willingness to admit to God that she could not manufacture love by herself. She had to ask for it like a beggar, and when she did, God poured it into her. Teresa describes it as a new heart placed inside the old one. not by removing the hurt or the history, but by filling the emptiness with something stronger. The woman still remembered every careless word her husband had spoken every time he had chosen his work over her. Presence, every moment of loneliness. But now she could choose to forgive those things, not because they did not matter, but because grace gave her the strength to carry them without bitterness. After years together, he had not fought for her because he did not know there was a fight. He had assumed she was content, or at least resigned, and he had accepted that as sufficient. But Teresa saw that when his wife's heart changed, his own soul responded. She writes that God used the wife's renewed love to awaken something in the husband that had gone quiet, a tenderness he had forgotten he was capable of. He began noticing her again. He began asking her questions instead of assuming he knew what she thought. He began choosing to sit with her in the evenings instead of falling asleep immediately after supper. Small things, nothing dramatic, but real. Point, one or both of them chose to let God rebuild what had broken. She saw that this kind of faithfulness, invisible and unglamorous, is one of the highest forms of charity. Teresa knew suffering. She had been chronically ill for most of her adult life, experiencing paralysis in her 20s that left her unable to walk for 3 years, migraines that blinded her for days, heart pain so severe she thought she was dying. She had endured opposition from within her own order, from bishops, from the Spanish Inquisition. She had watched convents she founded nearly collapse from poverty. She knew what it meant to keep going when everything inside you wanted to quit, and she recognized that same quality in the woman's choice. In that letter, preserved in the collection edited by Father Silverio de Santa Teresa in the early 1900s and republished in the complete letters edition of 1984, she recalls this vision briefly. She tells the nun not to underestimate the power of one person's decision to stay. She writes, "Even if only one chooses love, God can use that choice to transform both. Do not despair over what looks dead. God raises the dead." The letter is dated March 5th, 1578, written from the convent in Avila while Teresa was dealing with a jurisdictional dispute with the local bishop. She was 63 years old, 4 years from death, exhausted from decades of travel and conflict. But she took time to write 4 pages of careful counsel to a young nun whose sister was contemplating leaving her husband. She did not believe that every marriage could be saved, nor did she ignore the reality of abuse, cruelty, or betrayal. In her letters to women trapped in violent marriages, she advised separation when necessary. She believed in protecting life over preserving appearances. But she did believe that most marriages fail not because the love was never real, but because people stop asking God to sustain what they cannot sustain on their own. She believed that grace is not just for monks and mystics. It is for the ordinary husband who wakes up tired, for the ordinary wife who feels forgotten, for the couple who have run out of words but have not yet run out of will. Asked him to make it whole. That is what heaven celebrated. Not perfection, but honesty. Not strength, but surrender. Teresa saw this pattern repeated across her spiritual direction. The souls who made the most progress were not the ones who pretended to be holy, but the ones who admitted they were broken and asked for help. Pride keeps people stuck. Humility opens the door to grace. Teresa saw that when the woman made that choice, something shifted in the spiritual realm. She describes it as a light breaking through a crack. The marriage had been under attack, Teresa understood, not from outside circumstances, but from the quiet despair that convinces people that nothing will ever change. When the wife refused to believe that lie, the attack lost its power. Teresa believed in the reality of spiritual warfare. She had seen demons, described them in her writings as ugly, powerless, but persistent. She knew they worked not through dramatic possession, but through whispers, suggestions, discouragement. The whisper in this case was simple. You will never love him again. This is who you are now. Accept it. When the woman rejected that whisper and asked God for something different, the demon lost its foothold. She also saw that the couple's recommitment did not just affect them. Teresa writes that she perceived a ripple moving outward from their choice, touching their children, their neighbors, even people they had never met. She explains it this way. Every act of love strengthens the fabric of the world. Every act of fidelity makes it easier for the next person to believe that fidelity is possible. We do not see it, but heaven does. Teresa understood that the spiritual realm and the physical realm are connected, that choices made in secret have consequences that spread invisibly. This was not superstition for her. It was theology. The Church teaches that we are the body of Christ, one organism, connected across space and time. When one part suffers, all suffer. When one part heals, all benefit. The couple did not know it, but their reconciliation became a source of grace for others struggling with the same temptation. He had made a joke at her expense in front of their children, something small, but for the woman, it was the final weight on a scale that had been tilting for years. And in that moment, the woman had felt a door open inside her, a door that led toward coldness, toward shutting down completely. She stood at that door for what felt like a long time. Teresa could see it clearly. The woman's will was balanced between 2 choices. give in to the cold and live the rest of her life numb, or cry out for help one more time. And then, Teresa says, the woman whispered a single prayer, "Just help me." 2 words. That was enough. God moved. The woman gave him permission to intervene, and he did. This matches Teresa's broader teaching on prayer. She insisted that prayer is not about beautiful words or mystical experiences. It is about showing up, even when you feel nothing, even when the words are clumsy, even when you are angry or confused. The saints, she wrote, are not people who pray perfectly. They are people who keep praying when it feels pointless. What Teresa did not see, she admits, was the practical unfolding of their reconciliation. She did not see the conversations they had, the apologies, the slow rebuilding of trust. She only saw the spiritual reality behind it. But that, she insists, was the part that mattered most. The outward actions followed from the inward change, not the other way around. This distinction was important to Teresa. She had seen too many people try to fix their spiritual problems through external behavior alone, through more masses, more penances, more good works, without ever addressing the condition of their hearts. It does not work that way, she insisted. The heart has to change first, then the actions follow naturally. She had seen visions of great saints, of souls in purgatory, of mysteries that shaped the whole church. She had seen St. Joseph appear to her multiple times, instructing her in the founding of convents. She had seen Christ himself, wounded and bleeding, asking her to comfort him through her reform work. She had been given knowledge of theological truths that theologians spent lifetimes debating. She had seen the hierarchies of angels, the different degrees of glory in heaven, the varying levels of suffering in purgatory. Why show her something so small, so private, so seemingly insignificant as one ordinary marriage being restored? The answer she received was simple. Because you forget that I care about this. Because my people think I only watch the great things. I watch everything. That answer stayed with Teresa for the rest of her life. She would repeat it to her nuns, to the priests who came to her for counsel, to the lay people who sought her advice. She told them that God is not distant, not distracted by more important matters. He is near, he is watching, he is waiting for the smallest opening to pour his love into the places we have locked shut. This became one of her central teachings. She wrote about it in the interior castle, in the 6th dwelling places, where she describes how God works in the soul, not through dramatic interventions, but through quiet, persistent invitations. He does not force, he waits. And when we finally open the door, even a crack, he floods in. Among the families who supported the foundation were the same couple she had seen in the vision. They donated a significant portion of the building costs, 1,200 ducats, a substantial sum equivalent to what a skilled craftsman might earn in 5 years. Teresa mentions them briefly in a letter to her brother Lorenzo, noting that their generosity came from a place of gratitude. She does not elaborate, but the implication is clear. They knew what God had done for them, and they wanted to give back. The letter is dated September 23, 1574, written while Teresa was traveling between Segovia and Avila. She was dealing with resistance from the local Carmelite provincial, who opposed her reform and wanted to shut down her new convents. But she took time to acknowledge the couple's gift. She kept it between herself and her confessors. This was her practice with all private revelations about living people. She believed it would have been presumptuous, even cruel, to tell them what she had seen. They did not need to know that heaven had celebrated their choice. They only needed to keep choosing. But she did speak with the wife one last time, shortly before Teresa's death in 1582. The conversation took place in Alba de Tormes, where Teresa had stopped on her way back to Avila. She was dying, she knew it. Her body was failing, worn out by decades of illness, travel, and ascetic practice. But when the woman came to see her, Teresa sat up, smiled, and asked how she was doing. Had almost given up on her marriage. She said she could not remember exactly what changed, only that one day the cold feeling lifted, and she found herself able to love her husband again. Not perfectly, she said, but truly. It was as if something that had been frozen inside her had thawed. She did not understand it, but she was grateful. Teresa replied, "He gave you back what you thought was lost. Not many receive that grace. Cherish it." The woman nodded, tears in her eyes. She thanked Teresa for her prayers, though she did not know the extent of what Teresa had seen or how deeply Teresa had interceded for her. Teresa squeezed her hand and said, "Keep praying for your husband. Even when it is easy, keep praying. The battle is not over just because you won one fight." Years later, after both Teresa and the husband had died, the woman was interviewed by a church investigator gathering testimonies for Teresa's canonization process. The investigator was a Franciscan friar named Fray Juan de Santa Maria, tasked by the Bishop of Avila to collect evidence of Teresa's sanctity. He traveled across Spain between 1590 and 1592, interviewing hundreds of people who had known her. He asked about miracles, about prophecies, about Teresa's character and habits. The woman mentioned that Teresa had once helped her through a difficult time in her marriage, though she did not know the details of any vision. She said only that Teresa had told her to keep praying, and that the prayer had worked. She added that she and her husband had lived together for 47 years before his death, and that the second half of their marriage had been far happier than the first, though she could not explain why. It is a small note, barely 2 paragraphs, easy to miss among the hundreds of pages of witness accounts. But it confirms what Teresa saw. The couple stayed together, the love was real, heaven had not lied. She saw that marriage is not just a contract or a feeling, but a battleground where human will and divine grace meet and wrestle and sometimes win. In her era, the Protestant reformers were teaching that marriage was purely a civil matter, not a sacrament, that it could be dissolved if the couple was unhappy. Teresa disagreed. She believed marriage was a sacrament precisely because it required grace to survive. The Church, she insisted, did not make marriage hard by refusing divorce. God made marriage hard by creating 2 sinners and asking them to become one flesh. The only way it works is if both ask him for help. And when we make that choice, Teresa insists, heaven erupts in joy. She had seen this. She had witnessed the angels celebrating. She knew it was true. And she spent the last decade of her life telling people that no struggle is too small for God to care about. No marriage too broken for him to heal. No heart too cold for him to warm. The monk who conquers pride in silence. The widow who forgives without recognition. The married couple who choose each other again when it would be easier to walk away. These victories, she said, are written in heaven in letters of gold. On earth, they pass unnoticed. But in eternity, they shine. This theme appears throughout her writings, but it is stated most clearly in a meditation she wrote in 1576, preserved in her minor, Works, where she reflects on the difference between earthly glory and heavenly reward. She writes that the world applauds what is visible and impressive, but God applauds what is hidden and humble. The world celebrates the preacher who converts thousands, but God celebrates just as loudly the mother who teaches her child to pray. The world honors the knight who wins battles, but God honors equally the man who conquers his own temper in the privacy of his home. Not extraordinary, but faithful, not dramatic, but true. She had seen enough in her 70 years to know that the saints most celebrated in heaven are often unknown on earth. She had met holy widows, holy servants, holy farmers, people who would never be canonized, but whose souls she had seen shining like suns. She writes, I saw that no act of love, however small, however hidden, is ever forgotten by God. And I saw that every refusal to love, however justified it seems to us, leaves a wound in the soul that only God can heal. Those words were written in 1571, but they apply just as much to marriages today. The struggles Teresa witnessed are not unique to the 16th century. Coldness, distance, the temptation to give up, these are universal. What Teresa offers is not a formula, but a testimony. She saw what happened when one person chose to bring a dying marriage before God. She saw heaven's response. She saw the grace that followed. Matters more than they will ever understand in this life. Teresa died in October 1582, on her way back to Avila from a foundation in Burgos. She was 67 years old. Her body gave out in Alba de Tormes, the same town where she had written about the couple's vision 11 years earlier. She died on October 4th, though the calendar reform that year meant the next day was October 15th. Her final words, witnessed by the nuns gathered around her bed, were, Lord, I am a daughter of the Church. She was buried in Alba, but her body was exhumed 9 months later on orders from the Carmelite provincial and found incorrupt, still flexible, still giving off a sweet fragrance. This phenomenon was examined by physicians, notarized and recorded in the beatification documents. In 1578, 7 years after the vision, Teresa was asked by a young married woman whether it was normal to feel nothing for her husband after 10 years of marriage. The question came during one of Teresa's visits to the convent in Medina del Campo, where she was resolving a dispute between 2 nuns. The woman was a benefactor of the convent, a merchant's wife, wealthy enough to support Teresa's work but miserable in her personal life. Teresa's answer was recorded by one of the nuns who overheard the conversation, Sister Ana de San Bartolome, who later testified about it during the canonization process. Teresa said, "It is normal to feel that way sometimes. It is not normal to stay that way. Ask God to stir your heart. He will, if you let him." Teresa replied, "Then you love anyway, with your will if not with your feelings, and you trust that one day the feeling will follow. And if it never does, you will still have loved, and that is enough." She paused, looked at the woman directly, and added, "But I have seen what happens when someone truly asks for help. God does not ignore that prayer. He may not answer the way you expect, but he will answer. Trust him." That exchange, brief as it is, captures everything Teresa learned from the vision. Love is not just emotion. It is decision. It is trust. It is the willingness to hand God the pieces and let him put them back together, even when we cannot see how. Teresa knew this from her own life. She had experienced spiritual dryness that lasted years, periods where prayer felt like talking to a wall, where God seemed absent or uninterested. But she kept praying. And eventually the dryness lifted. She learned that faithfulness is not about feeling God's presence every day. It is about choosing to believe he is there even when you feel nothing. Her body was exhumed 9 months later and found incorrupt, a phenomenon witnessed and documented by multiple physicians, including Dr. Vicente de Palacios and Dr. Geronimo de la Cruz, whose sworn testimonies appear in the Beatification Acts. She was canonized in 1622 by Pope Gregory XV, along with Ignatius of Loyola, Francis Xavier, Philip Neri, and Isidore the Farmer, all declared saints in the same ceremony in Rome on March 12th. She was declared a Doctor of the Church in 1970 by Pope Paul VI, the first woman to receive that title. Her feast day is October 15th, the day after her death according to the Reformed calendar. It is not quoted in marriage preparation courses. It is not famous. Students of Teresa's spirituality focus on her major works, on the interior castle with its 7 mansions, on the life with its dramatic conversion narrative, on the foundations with its stories of traveling across Spain in a covered wagon, founding convents against fierce opposition. But the vision is there, buried in the archives, waiting for those who need to hear that their marriage is not beyond hope, that their private choice to stay matters, and that heaven is watching with more delight than they could ever imagine. It notes the death of the wife, described as a woman of great faith and charity, survived by 3 children and 5 grandchildren. Her husband had died 2 years earlier, in 1594. The registry records their ages at death. The husband was 68, the wife was 64. They had been married for 47 years. The entry is written in Latin, in the careful hand of the parish priest, Father Mateo de San Juan. It includes the standard formulae: received the sacraments, died in communion with the church, buried in the church cemetery with prayers for the dead. Over 4 centuries. But the parish record remains, preserved in the diocesan archives in Salamanca, a testament to 2 ordinary lives that mattered more than anyone knew. No mention of struggle, no record of the moment they almost lost each other, no hint of the vision that revealed their hidden faithfulness. Just 2 names, 2 dates, and the word together carved into the stone,